Seeds are a really important part of growing vegetables, and there can be a lot to consider when selecting which ones to use in our gardens and fields. Some of us will seek out seeds that are certified organic or would prefer seeds that are produced locally, and others are happy with any inexpensive and easily available supply. The viability and reliability of the seeds is an important aspect for those of us who have struggled with poor quality seeds. But it is the choice of varieties that tends to be focused on a lot more, especially the preference for either heritage or hybrid varieties and various other classifications in between. And the selection between the two seems to depend on a lot of different factors, especially issues of control, reliability, and our expectations of the future. For me, it is a mix of all of these, and it usually depends on the type of vegetable, where I try to focus on what works best for me right now. But this is starting to change as the focus of my growing shifts. With a lot of vegetables, I typically only grow one variety, something that seems to work, even if I don't have much to compare to. But it is a tomato crop where we have grown the most diverse range of varieties, including a trial of 54 varieties a few years ago, and another trial of 28 varieties last season. The purpose of these trials was to find varieties that worked well in this context and that we like to eat. The varieties that we selected tended to be older varieties, often considered heritage varieties from other parts of the world. But this was mainly because we were generally looking for flavor in tomatoes, and we really like the large tomatoes that are more common among the older varieties. This is quite a bit different from what a lot of large-scale growers focus on, where they generally seem to prefer smaller cherry and medium-sized salad tomatoes, often ones that don't crack or split when traveling from the field to the market. We do grow some of these smaller and medium-sized types of tomatoes, but definitely lean towards the varieties that we think produce tastier fruit. Almost all of the varieties that we selected to grow again are open pollinated varieties, sometimes known as standard varieties, which have been produced through careful breeding at some point in the past, and maintained as a defined variety through controlled conventional pollination. And quite a few of them were known as heritage or heirloom varieties, which is more of a classification of how long ago the variety was bred, or ones that were a speciality of a particular region, some of which have become quite rare. So heritage and open pollinated varieties are best able to supply what we want from a tomato crop, at least what suits our current expectations and preferences. But we have only been growing tomatoes in the protected microclimate of a polytunnel, which greatly increases the number of varieties that we can choose from that will grow well. But there is probably only a very limited range of different tomato varieties that will grow well outside in this maritime climate that we have here in Ireland, and perhaps a heritage variety would work much better. That is what I found with the squash crop, which is also a marginal crop to grow outside in this climate. I have tried a number of different varieties of squash and pumpkins in the past, some of which were reasonably successful when we had good growing seasons, and others were not. But it wasn't until I started growing an F1 hybrid variety called Crown Prince, which was recommended by other growers in this climate, that I started to get much more consistent harvests of good quality squash. For the past 5 or 6 years, I've been growing primarily this variety, which is a type of squash that we really like to cook with and has a great taste, at least in the seasons that are warm enough for it to ripen. This was the first hybrid or F1 variety of vegetables that I grew, and the success I've had with it has prompted me to start trying other hybrid varieties. I had previously avoided them, partially because my usual seed suppliers didn't stock any hybrid seeds, and I'd also picked up a bias against these controlled varieties because I wasn't able to save any seeds from them. But I've been growing vegetables for many years without saving any seeds, so avoiding hybrids entirely for this reason didn't make as much sense. I still think that the inability to save seed from hybrid varieties is a significant issue, especially in the longer term. But in the shorter term and when starting out, I now feel that it is much less of an issue than I used to. The fact that these hybrid varieties are highly controlled is a related concern, as they are essentially a proprietary product, and we have to keep going back to the same source to buy new seeds each year. Each batch of seeds from a hybrid variety can only be produced with a first generation or F1 crossbreeding between 2 carefully bred and controlled parent plants, all of which is kept a secret. This allows the breeders to be the only source of these seeds, which allows them to profit from all of the work that goes into developing and maintaining these varieties. But for many growers, these hybrid seeds offer enough benefits to make it worthwhile paying the extra cost to be able to grow these varieties. In the case of the hybrid squash I started growing, it was the ability to produce a lot of tasty squash in a climate that usually isn't very suitable for growing squash that made it worth paying more. For other growers, it is often the uniformity and increased yields of the crops that are the main benefit, though this is often not so important for those of us growing at a small scale primarily to feed ourselves. And hybrid varieties can offer disease resistance, faster growth, better flavor, productivity, or other desirable characteristics. Perhaps if all of the work that had gone into breeding hybrid varieties had instead gone into breeding new open pollinated varieties, then we may have seen lots of new varieties that are open and easy to save seeds from that have similar characteristics. But that is not the world that we live in. We still use open pollinated seeds for most of the vegetables that we grow, but I've been slowly trying other hybrid options over the past few years. We now grow a hybrid variety of white turnip that I'd seen other growers recommend, and they are a lot more productive and tastier than the open pollinated variety that we used to grow. We have also started to grow a few hybrid varieties of beetroot and carrots, used by market gardeners, specifically because they are faster to mature for an earlier harvest. In one of the larger polytunnels, we only grow hybrid varieties of cucumbers, especially ones for pickling. But we also grow open pollinated varieties in the other smaller tunnel and have good crops from all of them. We have settled into growing one hybrid variety of calabrese or broccoli, a cabbage that is really impressive, and a hybrid spinach variety that we grow in the spring that works really well. But in all these cases, we don't really know how they compare to other hybrid or open pollinated varieties, especially for growing at different times of the year. And it's the same with the hybrid courgettes or zucchini variety that we rely on, as it works really well, and having consistency between the gardens and seasons is useful for the types of explorations that we do, so we have stayed with it. But I don't know if other hybrid or open pollinated varieties would be better for dealing with some of the issues that we have with these crops. We tried a hybrid variety of aubergine or eggplant last year, and it produced a much better crop than the open pollinated variety we had been growing for years. And we have definitely made the switch to hybrids for this crop, at least for the foreseeable future. When we started growing pak choi for the first time last year, I decided to start to try a hybrid variety. I figured that with this kind of crop, it might be better to begin with a highly bred variety until I get used to growing it as a crop, and then in a few years to explore other hybrid and open pollinated varieties to see how they compare. A common characteristic among most of the types of vegetables that I've tried hybrid seeds for is that they're not so easy to save seeds from. Most of them require extra care and attention to avoid cross-pollination, often leaving the plants in the ground for 2 seasons, and requiring quite a few plants to maintain the genetic robustness of the variety. And I find it interesting that there are often more hybrid varieties available for cauliflower and other crops that are hard to save seeds from. But the types of vegetable plants that are much easier to save seeds from often seem to have mostly open pollinated varieties available. There are exceptions, of course, especially with higher value fruiting crops, but if it is easy to save seeds from, I am more likely to prefer open pollinated varieties, and I'm more open to using hybrids for the others, at least until I get a bit more focused on seed saving. But hybrid seeds can cost up to 50 times more than open pollinated seeds, and this is one of the reasons why I've hesitated in the past in using them. But this difference in cost can be a bit deceiving, especially at the scale that we're growing at. For example, a packet of 25 seeds of the hybrid variety of squash that we grow works out to about 20 cents per seed, but each seed, if carefully grown, could produce 10 to 15 kilograms of squash. I can get open pollinated seeds much cheaper, but if I cannot get a good crop, then it's a waste of seed and growing space and effort. The cost of even the more expensive hybrid seeds can be insignificant compared to what we might be able to harvest, though I'm still more hesitant about the cost of some of the hybrid seeds, such as carrots. The general trend towards buying more hybrid seeds does mean that the less popular varieties are more likely to be dropped or discontinued by the seed companies, including a lot of open pollinated and heritage varieties, a process that I'm probably contributing to. I used to be quite interested in growing and saving seeds from varieties simply because they were rare, or at least a lot less common, or had an interesting story, origin, or history. Though that has been a lot less important to me in recent years, partially because there are very few heritage vegetable varieties still around that are actually from Ireland, or that were grown here for a long time. Most of that heritage seems to have been lost. So most of what is available is part of the heritage of some other place, often with a very different climate to what we have here. And I've become a lot less interested in growing varieties primarily because they're rare. I've been more focused on growing in abundance and developing skills to become a lot more successful as a grower, to be able to consistently produce abundant quantities of good quality vegetables, regardless of the type of varieties I grow. Both hybrid and open pollinated varieties are still part of that, including ones considered to be heritage or heirloom varieties, though this has been changing more recently. There is a big focus on heritage and heirloom varieties as part of climate change adaptation and for preparing for the possibility of abrupt societal collapse. Genetic diversity could really be a benefit in a changing climate, and varieties that can produce well in less than ideal conditions can offer more resilience. But in order for this to be useful, I think that we actively need to be testing and trialing varieties and possibly breeding new ones, rather than simply assuming that the older heritage or heirloom varieties are going to be better. And I think that there's a role for hybrid varieties in scenarios of rapid adaptation and change, even in more extreme prepper scenarios. I see some hybrid varieties as beneficial bridging or transition varieties that can be useful in producing in abundance quickly, especially with the potential increased yield, disease resistance, and other characteristics of the hybrids that are available. Although I cannot save seeds from these varieties, and they may be more difficult to purchase in the future, I have been buying extra quantities of seeds for the hybrid varieties that I know work well, and storing them in my freezer. Even if I may not be able to continue to grow these varieties in the long term, right now they can be beneficial. And if things get really serious, I have a stash of useful hybrid seeds that I know I can rely on and that I can share with others so that we can grow as much food as possible while we take the time to transition to whatever else might happen in the future. As we are developing more growing spaces in this Red Gardens project, I have been interested in doing a lot of variety trials of different types of vegetables to find varieties that work well in our context. And with the types of vegetables that are relatively easy to save seeds from, I want to save seeds from all the open pollinated varieties that do even reasonably well. I want to build up a reserve of many varieties, even if they aren't the best varieties for our context, so that there is a diversity of varieties to share and potentially use in the future, even though this does take extra space and effort. But if some of the hybrid varieties do significantly better or have characteristics that are useful, it might be time to buy extra seeds if I can. Unfortunately, the choice of seeds that we can buy has been impacted by Brexit, which has cut off our usual seed suppliers in the UK, which means that some of the hybrid and open pollinated seeds that we have come to rely on are harder to get. And with everything going on in the world, it's safe to assume, I think, that seed availability will be further impacted in the future. But for many people who are only starting to learn how to grow, I think all this discussion about heritage versus hybrid varieties can be a bit of a distraction. I think it is much more important to encourage people to be really successful as growers first, so that they can feed themselves and possibly others. I found that with some vegetables, heritage and open pollinated varieties are really appropriate. And in other cases, hybrid varieties can really help, especially while we learn and get established. And when we have the skills, experience, and knowledge and have developed our growing spaces, then we can go on to the next levels of building resilience. To wean ourselves off of the varieties and seed supplies that are controlled by others, to become much more focused in saving our own seeds and possibly even breeding new varieties, in addition to developing personal, local, and regional sufficiency in all of the other resources and materials that we need for growing our own food.